The lone farmhouse caught 16 desperate eyes in the swirling snowstorm, aware that this was their last chance before the freezing temperatures would kill them all. The eldest child, Ruby May, held a trembling 6-year-old against her body, while the remaining 7 youngsters crowded together behind her like frightened animals. Their flight had lasted 3 days, and the smallest among them had nearly lost consciousness from starvation and exposure. Within the aged farmhouse, Thaddeus Mercer remained perfectly still at his dining table, his gaze fixed on the uneaten bowl of beans he had warmed for his evening meal. A coffee mug made of cold metal was held in the weathered hands of the 45-year-old agriculturalist. His empty eyes caught the dancing candlelight, revealing a person who had abandoned hope for everything save continuing to breathe. The gale screamed through the cracks in the timber walls, yet Thad scarcely registered it anymore. Very little disturbed him in recent times. 24 months had elapsed since Calera had torn through their tiny community like death's messenger. 2 years had passed since he had laid his spouse Margaret and their twin sons Samuel and Joshua to rest in the solid earth behind their home. 24 months of conversing with spirits and consuming solitary meals. He had maintained the ranch through routine rather than optimism. The livestock needed to be fed, the barriers needed to be fixed, and the work kept his hands busy enough to keep him from thinking about the terrible time when his illness took everything he valued. The silence was broken by the forceful rap. Thad's head jerked upward, his forehead creasing. No one journeyed through these regions during nighttime, particularly not during such harsh weather conditions. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles to the east, and Copper Ridge required a full day's travel to the south. With his chair rubbing against the wooden planks as he got up from his seat, he carefully made his way toward the entrance. A louder, more insistent knock came next, and then a frantic, high-pitched voice pierced the wind. "Please, sir, we're dying from the cold out here." With his palm resting on the doorknob, Thad hesitated. A young woman, probably between 15 and 16, spoke in the voice. His jaw clenched as memories of Margaret surfaced, how she had never refused assistance to anyone in need. But that was previously, before everything collapsed and abandoned him with only harsh recollections and vacant chambers. "We have small children with us," the voice pleaded again, shaking with cold and terror. "Please, mister, just until the morning, I beg you." Thad caught a glimpse of movement in the swirling snow through the door's narrow window. A group of shadowy figures huddled together, too numerous to distinguish in a blizzard. His hand stayed motionless on the latch as his mind raced. Complicacies were brought on by visitors. Strangers brought questions he didn't want to answer and arguments he didn't want to have. But small children represented something entirely different. Thad broke the rules and opened the door. The wind instantly attempted to wrench it from his grasp, and snow lashed his face like miniature blades. What he witnessed caused his breath to catch in his throat. 8 children stood on his porch, ranging from approximately 6 years old to perhaps 15. They were completely submerged, trembling violently and clinging for warmth to one another. The oldest girl had intense green eyes and icy strands of matted reddish-brown hair that hung around her face. The smallest child, a young girl who appeared to be unconscious from exhaustion, was in her arms. "Thank the Lord," Ruby May whispered, her lips colored blue from cold. "We've been on the road for days, sir. The young children cannot go on any further." The group's shredded clothing, bare feet bound in strips of cloth, and pale expressions of hunger caught Thad's attention. These were not your typical tourists. These were fugitives, and from their appearance, they had been fleeing desperately from something terrible. He ought to close the door. He ought to direct them to continue their journey. Becoming involved with runaway children would bring nothing but problems, and he had endured sufficient trouble to last 10 lifetimes. But the smallest girl in Ruby May's arms reminded him of someone else. Someone with dark curls and pink cheeks who used to run to him when thunder frightened her during the night. The memory struck him like a physical assault, and before he could prevent himself, he stepped aside. He said harshly, "Enter before you die from exposure." And even as the words left his mouth, he mocked himself. As the children stumbled into his warm kitchen, bringing with them the scent of fear and desperation, Thad had no knowledge that opening his door would initiate events that would either rescue him or completely destroy him. Because what Ruby May had not yet revealed was why they were fleeing, who was pursuing them, and what those men would do to anyone who assisted their escape. The children dispersed throughout Thad's kitchen like terrified creatures, finally discovering shelter. While the others gathered near the fire, Ruby May carefully lowered the unconscious child onto the wooden bench by the stove. Thad observed them with increasing discomfort, noticing details that made his stomach twist. Fresh bruises on thin arms, welts across one boy's back visible through his torn shirt, the way they all recoiled when he moved too suddenly. "What is your name, girl?" In a harsher tone than he intended, Thad posed a question to Ruby May. "Sir, Ruby May." Rachel May Hollister. She maintained her composure despite her chattering teeth. "This is Daisy, my sister." She nodded toward the unconscious child. "And these are the other ones from where we came from. And where exactly did you come from?" Thad moved his pantry to get the little food he had. Some bacon, dried biscuits, and a jar of preserves Margaret had made before everything ended. Ruby May's eyes darted toward the door, then back to him. "The Riverside Home for Foundlings, sir. North of here, a journey of 3 days." The preserved jar froze in Thad's hand. He had been told that there was an orphanage in the town run by a man named Cornelius Wickham that took in unwanted children and supposedly gave them homes and schools. But the rumors also spoke of children who vanished, of severe punishment, of things that made grown men look away when the topic arose. "You escaped," he said. "It wasn't a question at all." "Sir, yes." The volume of Ruby May's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We had no choice." The youngest boy, perhaps 8 years old, suddenly spoke up. They were going to offer Daisy to the man with the gold teeth as a purchase. Said she was pretty enough to bring a good price. Ruby May's face went pale. "Hush, Tommy, don't." "It's accurate." Tommy's voice cracked with emotion. "And they were going to do worse to the older girls." "Mrs. Wickham stated that Ruby May needed to learn her place before becoming excessively mouthy." "Hush." Despite her snapping, Ruby May's hands were now trembling, not from the cold. Thad felt something cold and lethal settle in his chest. He had suspected abuse, but this was something far worse. Trafficking in people, slavery of children, the kind of evil that made a man freeze in the face and clench his fists without thinking. "How long have you been at that place?" he asked quietly. Ruby May responded, 2 years for most of us. When our families passed away or they were unable to keep us any longer, they took us from different towns. Said they'd give us good homes, but..." She wandered off, but Thad could fill in the blanks. He had seen enough of the world to know how these stories ended. Orphans disappeared into the shadows of civilization, used and discarded by people who saw children as commodities instead of human beings. "They're coming after you," he said. Another statement, not a question. Terrible nodding from Ruby May Mister. "Wickham doesn't let his property just walk away. He has men who use guns and dogs to catch escapees. They are vicious." In spite of her fear, she turned her green eyes directly at him. "Mister, you can't keep us. If they discover us here, they will also harm you. Soon as the storm breaks, we'll move on." But even as she said it, little Daisy whimpered in her sleep, and Tommy started coughing. The kind of deep, rattling cough that spoke of pneumonia setting in. The other children looked ready to collapse where they stood. His thoughts raced as Thad stared at them. He should feed them, let them rest until the storm passed, then send them on their way with supplies and directions to the nearest town. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he looked at Daisy's pale face and heard Tommy's worsening cough, he realized these children wouldn't last another day in the wilderness. And if Wickham's men caught them, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly through the storm, still distant but unmistakably heading in their direction. Ruby May's head snapped toward the window, her face draining of all color. "They found us," she whispered. The hoofbeats got louder and cut like thunder through the wind. Ruby May grabbed Daisy and pulled her toward the back of the kitchen, while the other children pressed themselves against the walls like they were trying to disappear into the wood itself. Thad felt a rage he hadn't felt since he'd laid his family to rest that made his chest tighten with their total terror. As he moved to light the candles, he whispered, "Get away from the windows. Go into the back room. Everyone, now." However, Ruby May frantically shook her head. No, mister, you don't understand. They will claim that you stole us if they discover us here. Mister, Wickham has legal papers stating that we belong to him until we turn 18. He has the law to his side. As he checked the ammunition in his rifle, Thad grimly replied, "The law has nothing to do with what I just heard. Selling children ain't legal anywhere, papers or no papers. You think that matters?" Ruby May's voice cracked. Wickham's got judges in his pocket, sheriffs who look the other way. He's got money and connections, and we're just orphans nobody cares about. Thad could make out outlines in the snow through the dim window. 3 riders, maybe 4, sitting their horses like men who'd done this before. They weren't rushing toward the house. They were taking their time, confident in their ability to handle one lone farmer. "How did you learn about this location?" Thad asked, still watching the riders. "Heard talk in town about a hermit farmer who minded his own business," Ruby May whispered. "Figured you might not ask too many questions, might let us rest a night before moving on." The irony wasn't lost on Thad. These children had actually come to his door due to his reputation for being unfriendly and wanting to be left alone. That would have made Margaret laugh. She'd always said his gruff exterior hid a good heart, even when he tried his hardest to prove her wrong. In contrast to the children's earlier desperate cries, a loud knock rang throughout the house. This was the knock of men who expected to be answered, who weren't asking for anything but demanding it. "Open up." The voice was deep, authoritative, with a hint of violence underneath. "We're looking for some kids who ran away. We arrived here after following them." Thad looked at the 8 young faces staring at him with a mixture of hope and terror in their eyes. Samuel's curiosity, Joshua's sly grin, and the way they looked at him as though he could solve any problem or defeat any monster were all things he saw in his own children. But he also saw Margaret's disappointment if he turned these children over to men who would hurt them. She'd never forgiven cowardice, especially when it came to protecting the innocent. "Do you have evidence that these kids are on my property?" Thad called through the door, his hand steady on his rifle. A different, cooler, more refined voice responded. "I am Silas Crane, representative of the Riverside Home for Foundlings. We have legal authority to recover our charges wherever they may be found. If you don't open this door, we'll have to search your property in another way." Ruby May's grip tightened on Daisy. "That's him," she breathed. "That's Wickham's enforcer. The person who—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the way she instinctively moved to shield the younger children told Thad everything he needed to know. "I don't see any children here," Thad replied loudly, "and I don't recall inviting you onto my land." The silence that followed was thick with menace. Then Crane spoke again, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "Farmer, we tracked them to your door. Their footprints are still visible in your snow. You got exactly 1 minute to produce them, or we'll come in and take them ourselves." Tommy's cough echoed in the tension-filled silence as he began to wheeze harder. One of the older boys, maybe 12, had tears streaming down his face as he stared at the door like it was the gates of hell itself. Thad found himself at a crossroads he'd never wanted to face. Give 8 frightened children to men who would either harm them or make enemies of people who have power, money, and legal authority. Either choice would have consequences, but only one would let him sleep at night. The problem was that he had long ago stopped caring about sleeping peacefully. 3 minutes, farmer. Crane's voice had taken on an edge of anticipation, like he was actually hoping for resistance. Thad made his choice. He moved away from the door, toward the children huddled in his kitchen. "Ruby May," he said quietly, "is there a back way out of that orphanage? Somewhere they might not expect you to go." Her eyes widened with desperate hope. "About 5 miles east of here is an old mine shaft. It connects to caves that run for miles underground. But mister, you can't. It's time." Crane's boot struck the wood, causing the door to explode inward, and 3 armed men burst into Thad's kitchen like wolves into a henhouse. Silas Crane stepped through the shattered doorway like death itself had come calling. He was tall and lean, and he wore a black coat that made him look more like an undertaker than a child recovery agent. He had pale eyes that made it seem like he was enjoying other people's fear. 2 other men flanked him, rough-looking types with the kind of scars that came from violence, not honest work. Well, Crane said softly, his gaze moving over the 8 children pressed against the kitchen walls. "They are there, my lost little lambs." Even though he was aware that the odds were against him, Thad kept his rifle aimed at Crane's chest. 3 armed men against 1, and children in the crossfire. But something in Crane's smile, cold and predatory, made Thad's decision easier. Thad said evenly, "These children are now under my protection. You want them, you'll have to go through me." Crane actually laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Your protection, farmer? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I represent legitimate business interests. These children are property of the Riverside home, legally bound to our care until they reach majority. Property?" Thad's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Children ain't property." "Oh, but they are." Crane pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Signed contracts, witnessed and notarized. Every one of these little ones agreed to indenture themselves to us in exchange for food, shelter, and education. Perfectly legal. Ruby May's voice shook with anger. "Nothing was signed by us. After you took us, you made up those documents." Crane shrugged. The word of criminals against legal documentation. I wonder which a judge would believe. One of Crane's men, a barrel-chested brute with missing teeth, stepped forward. "Enough talking, Silas. Let's just take them and get out of this cold." Crane, however, extended a hand and continued to examine Thad with those calculating, pale eyes. "I'm curious about something, farmer. What causes a man to suddenly decide to act as a hero for a group of runaway orphans after avoiding human contact for 2 years?" Thad felt the impact of the question physically. How did Crane know about his isolation? Concerning the 2 years? Unless, "You've been watching me." Thad realized this was not an accident. You knew they'd come here. Crane's smile widened. "The lonely mourner who has a soft spot for children? Yes, you have been a target of ours for some time. Grief makes people predictable, you see, and useful." Ruby May's face went white. "You led them here on purpose. You wanted us to find this place." Crane stated, "Occasionally the fox needs to think it's found the perfect hiding spot. Makes the hunt so much more satisfying." Thad felt the trap closing around him like iron jaws. This whole thing had been orchestrated from the beginning. But why? What did Crane get out of having him involved? Crane continued, speaking in a professional voice. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to lower that rifle and step aside. We'll get our possessions and head out the door. In exchange, we'll forget you were ever involved. And if I refuse, then you'll be charged with kidnapping, harboring fugitives, and interfering with legal recovery of indentured servants. You will spend the rest of your life in territorial prison, and your farm will be taken as compensation." Crane's eyes glittered with malice. Of course, accidents do happen to men who make themselves too much trouble. Like poison, the threat hung in the air. Thad could see the fear in the children's faces, but also something else, a desperate hope that someone, finally, would stand up for them. If you were Thad, what would you do? Risk everything to save 8 children you barely know, knowing it might get you all killed? Or give them up to save yourself, knowing what horrible fate awaits them? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Thad decided next would determine whether these children lived free or died as slaves. "You made one mistake, Crane," Thad said quietly, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Oh, and what's that?" "You made the assumption that I still had something to lose." Silas Crane's confident grin vanished forever as the rifle shot reverberated through the kitchen like thunder. But as his body hit the floor, the 2 remaining men drew their guns with deadly speed, and Thad realized his gesture of defiance might have just signed all their death warrants. The kitchen exploded into chaos as Crane's men opened fire. Thad dove behind his heavy wooden table, dragging Ruby May and little Daisy with him as bullets splintered the walls above their heads. In the cramped space, the other children dispersed like startled deer in search of shelter. "Go to the basement." While he was adjusting the bolt on his rifle, Thad yelled over the gunfire, "Now!" The man with a barreled chest and a smoking pistol was moving toward them, but instead of keeping an eye on Thad's flanks, he had focused on him. 12-year-old Moses Cartwright, one of the older boys, had grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and brought it down on a man's skull with a sickening crack. The gunman dropped like a stone. However, the third man, lean and quick as a snake, had already positioned himself by the door, preventing their escape. His cold eyes swept the room, calculating angles and cover, professional in his violence. "Enough!" he yelled. "Farmer, put down the gun or I'll start shooting kids." To prove his point, he swung his gun toward 10-year-old Beth, who was pressed against the wall with tears streaming down her face. His grip on the trigger became more rigid. Thad had no choice. He set his rifle on the floor and slowly stood up, hands raised. The gunman said, "Smart man, now we're going to easily walk out of here. Every one of us." However, Ruby May was already moving as he spoke. Thad's hunting knife was 3 feet away on the kitchen counter, something the assailant had missed. With the desperate courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose, she lunged for it. The gunman spun toward her, but Thad was already in motion. 2 years of grief and rage exploded out at him as he tackled the man, both of them crashing into the wall with bone-jarring force. They fought like animals, rolling across the floor, each trying to gain control of the gun. The weapon went off again, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling, then again, shattering the window and letting in a blast of freezing air. Thad could feel his strength giving out. He was a farmer rather than a fighter, and his grief had weakened him. But then Ruby May was there, the hunting knife flashing down. The gunman screamed and released his grip on the pistol, clutching his wounded arm. Thad grabbed the weapon and rolled away, breathing hard. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing and the wind howling through the broken window. Tommy then resumed his wet and rattling coughing in the sudden silence. "We need to go," Ruby May said urgently. "He probably told others where he was going because Crane said he was watching you. More men will come looking when these don't return." Thad looked around his destroyed kitchen, his haven for 2 years. Bullet holes in the walls, blood on the floor, the door hanging off its hinges. There was no going back from this. He'd killed a man, fought others, and made himself an enemy of people with resources and connections. "The caves you mentioned," he said, checking the loads in the captured pistol. "How far?" 5 miles east, but it's rough country in this weather," Ruby May replied. "And we got little ones who are already sick and weak." Daisy began to cry, making a weak, meowing sound that suggested a fever and exhaustion, as if to emphasize her point. Beth was shivering uncontrollably despite being near the stove, and Tommy's breathing was getting worse by the minute. Thad made another impossible calculation. Stay here and fight whoever comes after you, probably losing your life along the way. Or venture into a blizzard with 8 sick children, probably dying in the process. Either way, the odds were grim. But at least in the caves, they'd have a chance. "Everybody grab whatever warm clothes you can find," he ordered, moving toward his bedroom. "Food, blankets, anything that'll keep you alive. In 5 minutes, we will depart." As the children scrambled to gather supplies, Thad stared down at Crane's body. The man's pale eyes were still open, still staring, but the arrogance was gone forever. In his coat pocket, the legal documents that supposedly made these children property were already soaking up blood. Ruby May appeared beside him, her young face hard with determination. "You didn't have to do this for us," she said quietly. "Now, like we are, you're a fugitive." "Maybe," Thad replied, shouldering his rifle. "But at least I can sleep at night because I'm a fugitive." The storm was getting worse outside, and more of Wickham's men were probably already riding toward the remote farmhouse in the darkness. But as Thad looked at the 8 young faces depending on him for survival, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years: purpose. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will test everyone's will to survive, and you won't want to miss how this desperate escape unfolds. With 8 lives on the line and 5 miles of frozen hell between them and safety, they only had 30 minutes before the next group of hunters arrived. Thad was unaware that their real problems were only beginning. Their steps were quickly swallowed by the frozen wasteland that extended in every direction beyond Thad's farmhouse. The wind cut through their borrowed coats like knives, and the snow was already knee-deep on the smaller children. While Ruby May helped Tommy, whose coughing had become so severe that he was unable to walk, Thad carried Daisy on his back. When they heard it, it was the distant sound of men's voices and hoofbeats, getting closer by the minute, as they had been trudging through the blizzard for more than an hour. Down! The children were pushed behind a group of snow-covered boulders by Thad, who hissed. Nobody moved, nobody breathed loud. They could make out at least 6 riders moving in a search pattern across the landscape through the swirling snow. These weren't the same men who had come to the farmhouse before. Rather, they were new hunters who had probably been sent there because Crane hadn't come back. "Spread it out," one of the riders shouted. "They can't have gotten far in this weather." Marcus, then 13, quickly put his hand over Beth's mouth as she began to whine from the cold, his own face twisted with fear. They all knew what would happen if they were caught now, after what had happened at the farmhouse. There would be no mercy, no legal pretense, just bullets and shallow graves. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot, close enough that Thad could hear their horses breathing. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, pulled up near their boulder and studied the ground intently. "Got tracks here," he called out. "Fresh ones heading east." Thad's blood turned to ice. In their desperation to get away from the farmhouse, he hadn't been careful enough about covering their trail. The snow was falling hard, but not hard enough to completely hide the footprints of 9 people. "How many?" Another rider asked, moving closer. "Looks like all of them, plus 1 adult." The scarred man's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "They're maybe an hour ahead of us, moving slow because of kids." "Good," Ken replied. "Wickham wants them alive if possible, but he's offering a bonus for the farmer's head. Says the man needs to be made an example of." As the riders spurred their horses forward, following the trail east, Thad realized their situation had gone from desperate to hopeless. The men were mounted and moved more quickly than a group of tired children could. Worse yet, they were already on their way to the caves that were supposed to be their haven. "We can't make it," Ruby May whispered, her lips blue with cold. "They'll catch us before we reach the mine shaft." Thad looked at the 8 young faces surrounding him, all of them looking to him for answers he didn't have. Tommy's breathing was getting worse. Little Daisy was burning with fever, and the others were showing signs of frostbite despite their borrowed clothes. But as he watched the riders disappear into the snow, an idea began forming in his mind. A terrible, desperate idea that might save the children's lives at the cost of his own. "Ruby May," he said quietly, "you remember the way to those caves?" "Yes, sir. Approximately 3 miles to the northeast of here, but take the others and keep going. Stay low, move quiet, and don't look back no matter what you hear." Her green eyes widened with understanding. "No, mister, we ain't leaving you behind. You don't have a choice." Thad was already checking his weapons, counting ammunition. "Those men are tracking us, which means someone needs to give them something else to track. Someone needs to lead them away from you." "That's suicide," Marcus said, his young voice cracking. "You are the only one of the 6 of them." Thad replied, "Maybe. However, I have something they don't have." "What?" "There's nothing more to lose." He gave Ruby May the majority of his ammunition and the remaining food supplies. "Get these children to safety. Find individuals who will assist them. Set up new lives far away from here. Promise to me." Tears were freezing on Ruby May's cheeks. "I promise. But, mister, what's your name?" "Your real name?" "Thomas Mercer. Additionally, I once had 2 boys about the same age as Marcus and Tommy here. Their names were Samuel and Joshua." The weight of that revelation hung in the frozen air. This wasn't just about saving 8 orphans anymore. This was about a broken man trying to honor the memory of the children he'd failed to save. When Thad got his feet, he said, "Tell them about me sometimes." Relate the story of the farmer who decided to fight. He was moving away from them before any of the children could say anything more, and he deliberately left tracks in the snow that led southwest, away from the caves, away from safety, away from any hope of survival. He could hear Ruby May addressing the group behind him, her voice clear despite her tears. "Come on, everybody, we got to move now." He thought of Margaret and the boys who were waiting for him somewhere beyond the pain and cold as Thad disappeared into the blizzard while making as much noise as he could to attract the attention of the hunters. For the first time in 2 years, he was going to see them again. But first, he had 8 young lives to save. Thad's plan worked better than he dared hope. Within a period of 30 minutes, he could hear the hunters behind him, their horses' hooves roaring across the ice as they followed his deliberately obvious trail. To ensure that they focused on him rather than the children, he had broken branches, kicked snow, and even fired his rifle into the air. But now, as he crouched behind a fallen log with only 3 bullets left and 6 armed men closing in, Thad realized he might have been too successful. The hunters had surrounded the group in a large circle, obstructing every possible escape route. Their leader, the scar man who'd found their tracks, sat his horse like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Give it up, farmer," the man called out. "You're surrounded, outnumbered, and those kids are probably frozen to death by now anyway. Make this easy on yourself." Thad didn't answer. He was thinking about Ruby May and the others, hoping they'd reach the caves by now. In his mind, he could see them huddled together for warmth, maybe building a small fire to keep little Daisy alive. "Safe, free," the scar man went on. "I know you can hear me. My name is Dean Morrison, and I've been looking for fugitives for the past 15 years. Never lost a bounty yet, and I don't intend to start now." That's when Thad heard something that made his blood turn to ice. The sound of children crying, carried on the wind from somewhere behind Morrison's position. "Oh, did I say that?" Morrison's voice took on a cruel edge. "We found your little friends about an hour ago, holed up in some old mine shaft, sick as dogs and twice as helpless." No, it simply cannot be true. Thad had given them enough of a head start, had drawn the hunters away from the caves. "Unless you're lying. You want proof." Morrison called out, "Jenkins, bring one of them up here." A moment later, another rider appeared, and Thad's heart shattered like glass. Little Beth was tethered to the saddle in front of Jenkins there. She was alive, though her lips were cold blue and her face was streaked with tears. "We got all 8 of them," Morrison said, "plus something extra. Seems like that Ruby May girl had some interesting things to say about what really goes on at the Riverside home. Real interesting to the kind of people who pay good money for that information." The full horror of the situation crashed over Thad like an avalanche. These men weren't just bounty hunters bringing back runaway orphans. They were part of something bigger, something darker. Instead of returning to an orphanage, the children were being sold to the highest bidder. And it was all his fault. If he just turned them away from his door, if he'd minded his own business like he had for 2 years, they might have found somewhere else to hide. Instead, his effort to save them had landed them in the hands of monsters right away. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued. "You're going to come out with your hands up, and we'll make your death quick. Clean bullet to the head, over and done. However, if you continue to play hero, we will make you observe what we do to these children before we put you down like a dog." Jenkins pulled out his knife and held it close to Beth's throat to make his point. The little girl whimpered, her wide eyes searching the landscape for any sign of rescue that wasn't coming. Thad closed his eyes and thought about Margaret. What would she do? What would she tell him to do? The answer came to him with perfect clarity. Margaret always said that some things were worth dying for, but more importantly, some things were worth living for. And sometimes the only way to save what mattered was to sacrifice everything else. "All right," Thad called out, standing up slowly. "I'm stepping out." He stepped into the open, hands raised, his rifle lying in the snow behind him. Morrison gave a happy smile, but Thad didn't look at him. He was looking at Beth, trying to communicate something with his eyes. "Trust me. Be ready. Smart choice, farmer. Now walk toward me, slow and easy." Thad started forward, counting steps. 15 meters. 10. 5. Close enough to see Morrison's scarred face's cruel satisfaction. Close enough to smell the tobacco on his breath. Close enough to grab the hunting knife from Morrison's belt and drive it deep into the man's leg before anyone could react. Morrison yelled and sank from his horse, bleeding profusely from his wound. In the confusion, Beth broke free from Jenkins and ran toward the trees. Although the other hunters were yelling and waving their weapons,